I was 24 when I got my first real job after college, a night shift clerk at St. Joseph's Medical Center in a small town in Pennsylvania. It wasn't a glamorous role. Mostly, I handled intake forms, answered late-night calls, and kept an eye on the reception area while nurses and doctors did the real work. Still, the job paid decently, and the overnight shifts meant fewer supervisors breathing down my neck. My schedule was simple: clock in at 10 p.m., clock out at 6 a.m. Most nights were slow. I'd spend hours sipping bad coffee and scrolling endlessly through my phone. That changed on one Thursday night. The weather had been ugly all day, heavy rain pounding against the windows, rattling them in their frames. A flood warning had gone out for the surrounding counties, but St. Joseph's sat on a small hill, so nobody seemed too concerned. Still, the hospital felt emptier than usual that night. It was close to midnight when a woman rushed in through the main entrance. She looked frantic, soaking wet, her hair plastered to her face. She clutched a small boy in her arms, maybe 5 years old. She screamed, "Help!" her voice echoing through the lobby. "Please, he's not breathing!" I jumped up so fast I nearly knocked over my chair. I shouted for a nurse while running toward her. Within seconds, a team appeared from down the hall, taking the boy from her arms and rushing him toward the emergency wing. The woman collapsed into one of the waiting room chairs, sobbing uncontrollably. I tried speaking to her, asking basic questions for the intake form, such as name, address, and the boy's information. But she was incoherent. A nurse came over and gently pulled her away to another room to calm her down. I stood there for a few moments, heart racing. It had been the most chaotic thing I'd seen in my 6 months working there. And it was only the beginning of the night. About an hour later, the hospital was dead silent again. The rain kept slamming against the windows, even harder now. It blurred everything outside into a foggy gray smear. I was staring at the front doors, half zoned out, when I noticed something strange. There was someone standing just beyond the glass, a man, tall and thin, wearing what looked like hospital scrubs. But he wasn't coming inside. He just stood there, unmoving, facing the entrance. I blinked, wondering if it was just the rain playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, he was still there. Creeped out, I hesitated. Then I got up and approached the door. As I got closer, I could see him more clearly. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he had deep, dark circles under his eyes. His scrubs were soaked through. I motioned for him to come in, pulling the door open slightly. "Sir, do you need help?" I called out over the rain. He didn't respond, just stared at me. I was about to step outside when a voice from behind made me jump. "Who are you talking to?" It was one of the nurses, Monica. She had come up behind me without me noticing. I turned around to answer her, and when I turned back toward the door, the man was gone. Vanished. Monica gave me a weird look. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, embarrassed. "Thought I saw someone," I mumbled. She shrugged and went back to her station, but my skin crawled for the rest of the shift. Around 2:30 a.m., something even weirder happened. The hospital's old PA system crackled to life. Normally, it was only used for emergency codes, code blue, code red, etc. But this time, all it said was, "Security to the morgue. Immediate assistance needed." The voice sounded wrong, distorted, garbled, like someone was talking underwater. I looked at Monica, and she looked at me. Neither of us had ever heard anything like that before. Technically, I wasn't security, but the real security guard on duty, Todd, was on break, and the hospital was already short-staffed. "Stay here," Monica said quickly. "I'll go check it out." She grabbed her walkie-talkie and headed down the hallway, her sneakers squeaking on the tile. I sat there, Nerves shot, trying to calm myself. 15 minutes passed, then 20. No word from Monica. I tried calling her on the hospital's internal phone system. No answer. I tried Todd's walkie-talkie. Nothing. Finally, I stood up, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe her radio died. Maybe she ran into Todd. Maybe it was nothing. Still, the dread weighed heavy as I made my way toward the basement level. The morgue was located in a dingy, isolated wing of the hospital. Old linoleum floors, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a faint smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. I called out softly, "Monica!" No answer. I reached the morgue door. It was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and peeked inside. Empty. Rows of stainless steel drawers lined the walls. The temperature dropped instantly, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. I didn't want to go inside, but I noticed something that made my heart skip. One of the drawers was halfway open, and sticking out of it was a hand, pale, lifeless. Fingers curled slightly. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. I turned and sprinted back toward the stairs. I didn't stop until I was back at the reception desk, gasping for air. When I caught my breath, I called the real security number. Within minutes, 2 security guards arrived and went down to check the morgue. They didn't find anything. No open drawer, nobody, no sign of Monica. She was just gone. The police were called. They combed the building and questioned everyone. By morning, the story was that Monica had walked out. They found her badge and jacket in her car, but no trace of her. No surveillance footage of her leaving. Just gone. Like she was never there. The hospital management told us not to talk to the media. They didn't want rumors spreading. But everyone at St. Joseph's knew something was off. I quit 2 weeks later. I couldn't take the late nights, the empty hallways, the cold silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear the PA system crackling to life, whispering my name. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support truly encourages us and helps this channel continue to grow. And don't forget to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. It started when I was hired as a patient transporter at Westfield General Hospital in Ohio. Nothing fancy. My job was just to move patients between departments, ER to ICU, imaging to recovery, recovery to discharge. A lot of pushing beds, waiting for elevators, and smiling politely. At first, I didn't mind it. The pay was decent, and most of the nurses were cool. But there was one rule everyone knew, even if it wasn't written anywhere officially. Avoid room 209. If possible, don't accept transports to or from there after dark. If you did, you were on your own. I thought it was just an inside joke for the newbies. Hospitals always had stories, right? Places people claimed were haunted, cursed, or whatever. I didn't believe any of it until my 5th week on the job. It was a Wednesday, around 7:30 p.m., about an hour before my shift ended. The dispatch radioed me, telling me that a patient in room 209 needed to be transferred to imaging for a CT scan. I hesitated. The hallway leading to the 200s was already dim and isolated, away from the main hospital wings. Most of the rooms there were reserved for overflow patients, people who weren't critical, but couldn't go home yet. Still, I wasn't about to look like a coward over some stupid superstition. I grabbed a wheelchair and made my way down. The 2nd floor was eerily quiet. Most lights were dimmed for the night. When I reached the 200 hallway, it was darker than the rest, like the bulbs were weaker somehow. Room 209 was near the very end, I knocked lightly and stepped inside. The room was cold. The patient, a man in his 50s, was sitting up in bed fully dressed, wearing a hospital gown under a heavy coat. He looked perfectly alert. No machines hooked up to him. No IV poles. He stared at me without blinking. "You here to take me?" he asked. I nodded. "CT scan, sir." "Shouldn't take long." He smiled slightly. Not a happy smile, more like a grimace. "Good," he said. "Let's get it over with." I helped him into the wheelchair. His body was stiff, and I could feel how tense he was, even through the layers of clothing. The whole time he didn't say a word, just kept staring straight ahead. Pushing him through the hallway felt surreal. The hospital always smelled of bleach and rubbing alcohol, but in that hallway, it smelled different, like mold, and something else I couldn't identify, like metal and dirt. As we moved, I noticed something weird. The wheelchair wheels kept sticking, like we were moving through patches of thick mud. But when I looked down, the floor was clean. I shook it off. Maybe the chair was old. Maybe I was just tired. Still, every instinct was telling me to move faster. The man in the chair finally spoke as we reached the elevators. "You're new," he said flatly. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "Just a few weeks." He chuckled under his breath. "You ever wonder why you're the one pushing me?" I didn't know how to answer. Before I could say anything, the elevator dinged and the doors slid open. We rolled inside. As the doors closed, he turned his head slightly, just enough so I could see his eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," he whispered. The elevator jerked violently, like someone had hit the emergency stop. The lights flickered. I hit the button for imaging again. Nothing. The man just sat there, grinning now. Then, after what felt like forever, the elevator shuddered and continued moving. When the doors opened, we were in a hallway I didn't recognize. The walls were yellowed and cracked. The floor was scuffed and stained. It looked like a part of the hospital that hadn't been renovated in decades. But there were no signs, no directions, no nurses. I had no idea where we were. I think we're on the wrong floor," I said awkwardly. The man in the chair laughed, a low, humorless laugh. "No turning back now," he said. I pushed him forward, heart hammering in my chest. I told myself it was fine. Maybe we'd hit some old maintenance level. But as we moved, I realized the lights were getting fewer and farther between. It was like walking into a tunnel. Then we passed a doorway on the left. Inside, there were dozens of hospital beds crammed together, all empty but made up neatly, like they were waiting for someone. The sheets were yellowed. Flies buzzed in the corners. I hurried past, refusing to look. The man in the chair started humming softly, a weird tune, off-key and slow, like a child humming a lullaby they barely remembered. After a few more minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped pushing and turned the chair around. "I'm taking you back," I said firmly. But when I turned the chair, it was empty. No man. Just an empty wheelchair. I stumbled back, heart slamming into my ribs. I scanned the hallway. Empty. No sign of him, not even footsteps. I left the wheelchair where it was and sprinted back the way we came. But the hallways didn't look the same. They twisted and branched, like a maze that kept shifting. Every time I turned a corner, it was another dead end or another abandoned room. The smell was worse now, thick and rotten. I couldn't breathe. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I found an old stairwell. The door was barely hanging on its hinges. I yanked it open and bolted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. When I pushed through the next door, I was back in the normal hospital. Bright lights, clean floors, nurses are rushing around. Normal. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. Erica, yes, Erica from my orientation saw me first. Jesus, are you okay? She asked. I nodded, too out of breath to explain. She walked me to the break room, where I sat down and tried to make sense of everything. When I finally told her what happened, she grew very quiet. Then she said something I'll never forget. Room 209's been closed for years, since the fire. Later that night, I looked it up. There had been a fire in that wing 10 years earlier. Electrical malfunction. Several patients had died, including a man in his 50s. Admitted for a CT scan he never got. He had died waiting in his room, alone. Room 209. I never worked another shift past 6 p.m. again. Not at Westfield. Not anywhere. Because even now, sometimes when I walk past a dark hospital corridor, I swear I hear a wheelchair squeaking somewhere in the distance. And that same low humming. Off-key. Waiting. When I graduated from nursing school, I immediately got a job offer at a small hospital just outside Asheville, North Carolina, Red Pine Medical Center. It wasn't the biggest or the best hospital, but it was a start, and I was eager to prove myself. Everyone warned me about night shifts. They said things felt different after 10 p.m. At first, I thought they were just teasing the new guy. My name's Zachary, by the way. Zach for short. And if I had known how wrong I was to brush off their warnings, I might have quit before my first month was over. It started on a Thursday night, just after 11 p.m. The ER had been relatively quiet. A couple of drunk college kids with minor injuries. One elderly woman with pneumonia. Nothing serious. I was restocking supplies when I got a call over the radio. Zach, can you head to room 312? We have a patient who must be prepped for ICU transfer. No problem. I grabbed the chart from the desk and made my way upstairs. The third floor was for recovery and observation. Dimmer lighting, fewer staff walking around. Just a few patients are sleeping off surgeries or waiting for further tests. I found room 312 easily enough. The hallway was strangely silent, though. Even by hospital standards, it felt heavy, like the air itself was thicker. When I entered, the patient was already sitting up in bed. A middle-aged man, bald, wearing a standard hospital gown. He looked a little rough, with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. I checked the chart. Douglas Whitaker, age 48. No visitors listed. No family contact. His record said he'd been admitted for respiratory issues, but something about his eyes made me hesitate. Sharp, alert. Not the glassy, tired look most patients had. You ready to head up, Mr. Whitaker? I asked. He didn't answer at first, just stared at me. Then, finally, he nodded slowly. I helped him get into a wheelchair, tucked the blanket around his legs, and started wheeling him toward the elevator. As we moved down the hallway, I noticed he kept glancing over his shoulder. Something wrong? I asked casually. He shook his head. But he gripped the arms of the chair tightly, his knuckles turning white. The elevator was slow, as usual. I stood there awkwardly, trying to make small talk. You'll be more comfortable in ICU, I said. Bigger rooms, better care. No response, just that same tense, coiled posture. When the elevator finally dinged open on the ICU floor, I pushed him out into the hallway. That's when I noticed something odd. The hallway was dark. Only a few emergency lights were on. Everything else was dead silent. No nurses at the station. No monitors beeping. No sound at all. It was like stepping into a different world. We reached the room assigned to Mr. Whitaker, ICU room 7. I pushed open the door. Inside, the monitors were off. The bed was empty. Strange. Usually, ICU beds were already prepped before a transfer. I turned to say something to Mr. Whitaker, but the wheelchair was empty. I froze. Where the hell did he go? The hallway behind me was still empty. No footsteps, no noise. My heart started hammering. Maybe he'd gotten up and wandered off. Patients did weird things under stress sometimes. I backed out of the room, trying to decide what to do. That's when I heard it. A door slowly creaking open farther down the hallway. "Mr. Whitaker," I called. No answer. I hesitated, then started walking slowly toward the sound. Every hair on my body stood on end. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Halfway down the hall, I passed another room. Room 9. The door was ajar. I pushed it open carefully. Inside, I saw a figure sitting on the floor, hunched over. It was Mr. Whitaker. He was clutching something to his chest, rocking back and forth. At first, I thought it was just a blanket or a pillow, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a hospital staff uniform, and it was covered in blood. I stumbled back instinctively. That's when Mr. Whitaker looked up at me and smiled. There was blood smeared across his mouth and chin. His eyes were wild, almost feral. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. I backed out of the room, heart pounding. I fumbled for my radio. "Security to ICU! Room 9! Now!" I barked into it. No response. Static. I turned and ran. I bolted back toward the elevators, but the doors wouldn't open. The button was dead. I raced toward the stairs instead, taking them 2 steps at a time. Behind me, I heard the faint patter of footsteps. Quick. Uneven. I didn't dare look back. When I finally burst onto the 2nd floor, I slammed the door behind me and locked it. I collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. It took about 10 minutes for security to find me. Apparently they'd gotten the call, but their radios had been glitching all night. When I explained what happened, they searched the ICU floor. Found nothing. No Mr. Whitaker. No blood. No discarded staff uniform. Nothing. The only thing they found was an empty wheelchair, abandoned in the middle of the hallway. Exactly where I'd left it. Later, the charge nurse showed me the patient intake records. There was no Douglas Whitaker admitted to room 312. In fact, room 312 had been empty for days. They were repainting it after a pipe leak. I never got a real answer about what happened that night. Some people think it was a psych patient who slipped through the cracks. Others whisper about old escapees from psychiatric hospitals that closed decades ago. I don't know. All I know is that somewhere in that hospital, there had been someone wandering around, pretending to be a patient, waiting for the next idiot to show up. Someone like me. And if you ever work a night shift at a small hospital, always double check who you're moving. Because sometimes, the ones who don't belong, they're the ones waiting just beyond the next door.